weeks ago, I started a fishing fighting game. As I said before, I'm making a fishing fighting game. The game follows a fisherman on a quest to defeat the biggest fish in order to become the king of the lake. This game will be split into 3 sections. Birding, a section focused on exploration. Fishing, a challenge to the fish below. And fighting, a struggle for survival. In this devlog, I will document all the progress I make. Enjoy! I started by drawing the fisherman and his boat. I didn't really like the first version, but the idea was there, so I made a few changes and added some detail. Now I was satisfied. The next step was animation. I did this in 3 steps. First, I removed his arms, then changed the oars, and finally added the arms back. Repeat that 3 more times and we get this. Now that I had a rowing animation, I wanted my guy to be able to rotate his boat with 1 oar, so I did this in both directions. With the art of my boat done, it was time to work on the actual game. My goal was to make the rowing as smooth and satisfying as possible. To achieve this, I made it so that when the oars are brought back, the boat is propelled forward. This motion is in time with the animation, specifically the change between this frame and this frame. I even added a blur to emphasize this. With the programming done, I ended up with this. I was happy with how it felt, but something was lacking. I decided that the solid blue background needed to be replaced with something more extravagant. I divided my new water into 2 layers. The darker left layer showed the depth of the water and the lighter right showed the surface. When both were combined, this was the result. This image was tileable. This meant they could be lined up seamlessly to form the waters of the lake. This also goes for the 2 layers from before. So for the animation, I just moved the 2 layers in opposing directions, and this was the final product. For the fishing section of the game, I decided to switch from the top-down perspective to a side view. This meant drawing the fisherman from another angle. Other than the hat, I hadn't given his design much thought, so I started by drawing the boat and the hat, as they were the main components I wanted. Next, I worked on his body, arms, and fishing rod. I tried to draw his head many times, but none of them turned out well. I just couldn't get it right. After taking a break, I came back to my headless fisherman and realized it was kinda slick, so I just left him as a floating hat. After the design was complete, I made a quick animation of him bringing back his fishing rod and casting the bait. With the art done, I moved on to implementing fishing into the game. My first plan was to have the player control the power of the cast. With this in mind, I made this. Next, I decided to create a way to select different baits. I was really proud of this as it looked really smooth. For now, all it does is change the color, but the bait is a core aspect of the game. For example, if the fisherman wants to catch a purple fish, it isn't as easy as casting a random bait and hoping to catch it. He needs a purple bait. This bait is made from red and blue fish, meaning that the player needs to catch 2 smaller fish in order to catch a bigger one. Now imagine if the red fish needed an even smaller fish to make its bait. This creates a line of progression which guides the fisherman through all the content in order to reach the final fish. With the bait selection done, I quickly realized that the power system was redundant, as the fish was already determined by the bait. Therefore, I scrapped it and moved on to my next plan. Plan number 2 was to have a cinematic where I could have more control over the pace, since the fishing was the transition between boating and fighting. As it was a cinematic, I drew a storyboard on paint. Even though it didn't look very good, it illustrated the concept I wanted. The idea was split into 4 parts. The first was the calm before the storm. The player had complete control, picking the bait and choosing when to cast the rod. Next was the suspense. As the bait sits in the water, the audience waits in anticipation, which builds tension. Then comes the climax, where a sudden shift happens and the pace becomes rapid. This intensity is maintained during the next panels until it reaches the final fight between man and fish. In order to create this cinematic sequence, I messed around with cameras and learned a lot. Eventually, I reached a stage where I had complete control over it. The last assets I needed were a fish and the intense lines. For the intense lines, I just drew lines towards the center. Then, on the next frame, I did the same but slightly offset. When these two are quickly played back to back, we end up with this. For the fish, I revisited an old project my friend and I made 3 years ago. The fish that I drew back then fit the style I was going for, so I thought it would be a good placeholder for now. With the preparations done, I went scene by scene, using the storyboard as my guide. This is what I ended up with. I feel like this section is what I'm most proud of, and is what took me the longest. It also acts as the perfect bridge to the next section. Fighting. Now this isn't your average fishing game, where the battle is over once the fish is reeled onto the boat. In fact, this is where the duel between man and fish begins. The fish is willing to fight for its life, but can only survive on the surface for a certain amount of time. Therefore, this becomes a test of evasion and survival for the fisherman. As usual, I started with the art. In this new section, I had to design what my fisherman looked like when he was standing. Of course, I kept the floating hat and chose to have a floating body. As you can see, I was really into the floating idea, and was like, why not let his arms float too? This looked good and was a lot easier to animate. For the fisherman animations, I needed 4 different types: idling, running, and jumping. These were quick to make and I was happy with them. The last type was a fishing rod attack. The attack was a large swing and it turned out well. Next, I moved on to the fighting fish. I wanted it to stand on its tail and look menacing. It took me a while to get the design right, but eventually I got there. Next, I worked on the idle and run animation. They turned out alright, but I had no idea how to approach its attack. Therefore, I made a temporary fist attack so I could start work on the game. For the game, I set up the controls for the player and implemented the art I just made. The player could run and jump around the boat, which is the arena they fight in. Next, I added the fisherman's attack and a cooldown for it. The attack actually doesn't do damage to the fish, instead it bonks them, which stuns them for a certain amount of time. Then I added the hearts and bubbles. The hearts were the player's health and the bubbles were the fish's time left on the surface. Next was the enemy. It had a basic AI where it walked in the direction of the player and would jump if the player was above. If the fish was close enough, it would start its attack. When the fist is red and it touches the player, a heart will be lost. This AI has a lot of flaws, but it is a start. All in all, I feel like there's a lot of potential and I can't wait to add more fish and attacks to the game. With the basic mechanics of boating, fishing and fighting done, the skeleton of the game is complete. Now all that's left is the content, which we will start on next time. If you enjoyed and want to stay updated on the game's progress, press subscribe and also check out my Twitter. Thanks for watching.